joining us, and take it away.
My pleasure, Jeff. And are you seeing my presentation now?
Yes.
Excellent. So let me kind of go past a few of these things and get to the agenda. Let me first say thank you to Orange Tree. I've been, later this year, I'll celebrate my 32nd anniversary in the drug testing industry. I've worked for drug testing companies. I've worked for employer organizations. I was the executive director of the American Council for Drug Education, the director of the Institute for Drug-Free Workplace. And I've had this business for the last 23 years. And I've worked with a lot of companies. And I have to tell you that Orange Tree is really among the very best that I've had the pleasure of associating with. They do things well, they do things right. They really do care about their clients and providing the best possible service. And for me, as a business owner and as somebody in the industry who relies entirely on my reputation to get me new business, my association with Orange Tree is a plus for me. So I'm happy to do this and happy to be associated with Orange Tree. And hopefully you'll get something out of today's presentation that's helpful to you. Now, this is the agenda for today's presentation. It's part 2 in a 3-part series that we in Orange Tree came up with. And I have to admit that had I given this part 2 presentation the day after part 1, it would have looked different. Some things have evolved, some developments on the legislative and legal side pertaining to drug testing in a couple of states have occurred since the last presentation. So we were updating this slide deck even this morning with some new information. So we're going to talk about the things that are on the screen, but let me set the stage with a little introduction, okay? So coming into 2020, we know that drug abuse was already on the rise. For the last 6 years, the government has been showing an increase in substance abuse throughout the country. And during COVID, substance abuse went up dramatically, and I've got a slide that I'll share with you, but we know that some people have started using drugs for the first time and others have increased the amount of drugs that they use as a way of sort of self-medicating their way through COVID. We know that the lockdowns resulted in unemployment skyrocketing to unimaginable levels, and it's been coming down, for several months now. We're now under 7%, and businesses are hiring again, and they're increasing their hires. Jeff and I had this discussion, and he talked a little bit about it in his introductory remarks, that employers are starting to hire again, of course, and we think that's going to continue to happen during the year, and that that some of them are finding it difficult to find talent, as Jeff mentioned about, especially hourly employees. Federal stimulus and concerns about healthcare, et cetera, are demotivating people when it comes to looking for a job. So some employers are struggling with the concept of screening for drugs, and especially for marijuana. So before I turn off my camera, let me share 2 slides with you, and then I'm going to turn off my camera and go into my full presentation. But during 2020, and every year, Current Consulting Group does employer surveys and drug testing industry surveys. And the last survey that we did, which came out at the end of the year in 2020, showed that, as you can see here, very few employers actually permanently halted drug testing in 2020 during the pandemic or due to the pandemic. You see that first teeny tiny bar at the top, less than 0.3%. If you go to the very bottom, 78, almost 79% said that they have not altered their drug testing program in any way, but the story is in between. Some temporarily halted drug testing until the end of the pandemic. When is the end of the pandemic, right? It goes on and on and on, it seems like. The third one down, we increased the amount of testing, 2.4%, and then we decreased the amount of drug testing at a little over 11.5%. So some employers have made alterations to their drug testing program. The majority have left it unchanged, and just a minuscule percentage have actually discontinued drug testing altogether. But when it comes to marijuana, a very small percentage have actually removed marijuana from the drug testing panel during COVID, or let's say since 2020. The vast majority continue, they indicate that they continue to test for marijuana. That's important because as we go into this period of increased hiring that Jeff talked about, and we're We're looking for the talent that we desperately need. We're hiring from a pool of people who have been part of the dramatic increase in substance abuse since the start of COVID. And so you don't want to remove marijuana from your panel. You don't want to discontinue drug testing. It may on the surface seem like it's making things harder by making it more challenging to find talent when people who maybe are qualified in every other way say, listen, I'm a marijuana user, it's legal in our state, and I'm not going to discontinue. So I'm going to talk about why you want to continue to test, even though you may have good prospective employees say that to you. Okay, so I'm going to turn off my camera now and go into my full presentation here. Okay, so I referred to some recent developments on state laws and legislation. Let me start there. So some of this will be a little bit of an overlap from part one, but it'll help to make the case for the new stuff that I'm going to talk about. So we know that back in November during the general election, that 5 more states voted to legalize marijuana. Since then, the state of New York has legislatively moved to legalize what's sometimes referred to as recreational or adult use marijuana. So beyond medical or medicinal marijuana, we're talking about just legalizing it for anyone 21 and older. The New York marijuana law, this new law that's been enacted, generally says that employers cannot take action against an employee for the use of recreational cannabis outside of work hours. It doesn't prevent an employer from taking action against a worker who's impaired by marijuana during the workday. Okay, and we'll talk about what that means here in a minute. In New Mexico, they have also passed a recreational marijuana law legislatively, okay? And look at that third bullet under New Mexico. Employers are provided certain protections under the act, which permits employers to maintain zero tolerance policies. Not the case in New York, but it is the case in New Mexico. And that's the sort of the rub here, because you've got states like New York that pass very lenient laws that are perhaps even overly protective of the marijuana user at the expense of workplace safety. And then in New Mexico, you have a law that basically builds into it employer protections. It prevents an employer from discriminating against a legal medicinal marijuana user, and that's always been the case in New Mexico because they had medical marijuana already. But when it comes to the use of recreational marijuana, employers may still maintain a zero tolerance to individuals being at work under the influence of marijuana. And I think I just skipped a slide here. Okay, so this is what the marijuana map looks like now. And you can see that the ones in orange are the states that have passed recreational marijuana. The blue states are the medical marijuana laws, and the white states are the ones that haven't legalized it yet. Not necessarily meaning to say that it's completely illegal in these states. I'm going to show you a chart here in a minute, okay? But this is what the map looks like now. We could have put the orange ones in green, I suppose, to make it a little bit more marijuana friendly. There's more happening though, okay? So in California, AB 1256 would prohibit pre-employment testing for marijuana throughout the state. There would probably be, if this thing actually happens, there would probably be a list of safety sensitive positions that are exempt from this prohibition. But that's the movement in California right now, AB 1256. In Philadelphia, the city council has voted 15-1 to prohibit pre-employment testing for marijuana, a la New York City. New York City already does that, although they too have a long list of safety sensitive positions that are exempt from the ban on pre-employment testing for marijuana. Atlanta, the mayor took executive authority, issued a law that basically prohibits pre-employment testing for non-safety sensitive public positions, not private sector, but public sector, but not just marijuana, all pre-employment testing. So if it's now again, there's the safety, what we call a safety sensitive carve out, but if it's a non-safety sensitive government position, you cannot conduct pre-employment testing in Atlanta. So you're seeing 3 different bites of the apple here, right? In California, it would prohibit pre-employment testing for marijuana. In Philadelphia, it would prohibit pre-employment testing for marijuana, but it would be just for safety sensitive positions. And then in Atlanta, just not any pre-employment testing, but only for public positions, public sector jobs. Now, I said earlier, these states that are in white on the map doesn't mean that marijuana is completely illegal in those states. This is a list of states that have done something, and it varies by state, so it would be a whole webinar presentation to go through it, but just sort of suffice it to say that these are states that have done something with the decriminalization law as it pertains to marijuana. So some of these are the, with the asterisk, are states that have already legalized marijuana in one way or another, but they decriminalize the possession of marijuana. So under a certain amount. And so even though marijuana may still be illegal in these states, under a certain amount, the law enforcement agencies are not going to take action against an individual. So this is a little bit further encroachment into sort of the legal deterrent impact of laws that prohibit marijuana use or prohibit marijuana selling in these states, even though they haven't necessarily legalized it. Now let's step over the line to, I talked about how some states or some municipalities are prohibiting all types of drug testing for any drug. So we know that back in November, Oregon voters passed a law that basically legalizes any Schedule 1 through 4 controlled substance, that be heroin, cocaine, etc. And that's for personal use, and it would only include a $100 fine, and the individual might, not necessarily would be required to, but might be asked to participate in a health assessment. That's Oregon, okay? So this is the first state to cross from marijuana into the whole world of drug abuse. DC passed a similar law, but it was really just, for what are called magic mushrooms, psilocybin, mescaline, etc. So it's not all drugs like Oregon, but it would be some drugs besides marijuana. DC already has legal marijuana. They have legal and medicinal and recreational marijuana laws. And then they also have a prohibition on drug testing, pre-employment drug testing. So what are we now seeing as far as states following the lead of Oregon? California, okay, we talked about California for drug testing, but now California, SB 519, is going to go to the Senate Appropriations Committee for a hearing in May. And this law, if it was passed and enacted, would make lawful, quote unquote, the possession of personal use, just like the Oregon law. So we're talking about magic mushrooms, psilocybin, we're talking about LSD, we're talking about ketamine, we're talking about MDMA, etc. So not every single illicit drug or Schedule 1 through 4 drug is listed in this California law, but this would be a significant breakdown of the barrier between, individuals who want to use drugs and being fearful of some type of legal recourse or consequence if they do that. That would be a major move in California. In Washington, as I talked about in part 1, the Supreme Court of the state of Washington, as you see in that first bullet, declared the state's law criminalizing drug possession as unconstitutional. And so it's again a breakdown of the legal deterrent to carrying drugs, to transporting drugs, to selling drugs, to using drugs besides marijuana. Washington had already legalized recreational and medicinal marijuana. This would be for other drugs besides marijuana. So you can see the breakdown occurring here throughout the country. Now, Jeff and I were having an interesting discussion before today's webinar in which I was sort of reflecting on all my 32 years in the business, but even before that, when the legalization movement started in the 70s, it was about legalizing all drugs, not just marijuana. And there was really no appetite for that. So the movement sort of started to focus just on marijuana and then eventually just on medical marijuana. And of course, now it's mushrooming out from that, no pun intended, and becoming about all drugs. And in the process, eliminating any barriers to drug use, including drug testing. So we're seeing some jurisdictions starting to poke their head under, inside the tent there on restricting drug testing altogether, but not entirely. So we're going to talk about the increased use of drugs right now, but as a precursor to that, just keep in mind that there's this trend, this legislative trend that's impacting employers' efforts to maintain safe and healthy workplaces by prohibiting drug use or prohibiting employees from being under the influence of drugs while at work. So I talked about this earlier, I referenced it. And a study from this first bullet is actually from the American Psychological Association. 13% of Americans in a survey that they conducted or authorized indicated that they had started or had increased substance use as a way of coping with the stress or emotions related to COVID-19. So we're seeing a lot of that happening throughout the country, where we're seeing more drug use, and we're even seeing people starting to use drugs for the first time as they try to self-medicate their way through the stresses and the challenges, the anxiety, et cetera, of the pandemic. We've also seen a spike in overdoses as a result. Well, I shouldn't say as a result of the pandemic. Overdoses were going up. Overdoses from, say, opioids, for example, had gone up between 2018 and 2019. We saw a small increase. We expected to see another increase in 2020, but COVID probably can be blamed for a dramatic increase in overdoses, as many people have turned to other drugs besides marijuana as their coping mechanism, their drug of choice during the pandemic. Some of the things that people might normally do to relieve stress in their life were taken from them, you know, hanging out with friends and being able to socialize in person with people. And so it sort of narrowed the things that people could do. And I think we really don't know the levels from 2020 yet. That's going to take, I think, another, well, with the federal government, their annual survey will come out in August, September timeframe. Then I think we'll see a pretty big increase. Now, why is that happening? This is just a quote I thought was pertinent. This is from a professor at the University of Kentucky who said, quote, "There's sort of a perfect storm of factors that we know increase drug use. People are more stressed and isolated, so they make unhealthy decisions, including drinking more and taking drugs." We saw that in the data, the study information that came out after 9/11. We've talked about that here at Orange Tree before, how some companies or some individuals dealt with the stress and the anxiety of 9/11 in Manhattan, in New York, by increasing their use of alcohol, cigarettes, and drugs. So one company was very helpful in sharing some data from their drug testing, 2020 drug testing positivity results. This is a large company, does a lot of drug testing, and by comparing 2020 data to 2019, they show, as you see to the far left, an increase in marijuana use in 2020 compared to 2019, a slight drop in cocaine use, and then a significant, almost 274% increase in opioid positives. And I used the term use, I should have been saying positive all along, positive drug test results, and a 215.7% increase in amphetamine positives. Very, very significant, right? Because when we talk about drug testing and creating a drug-free workplace, one of the questions I get asked often is, you know, which drugs should we test for? And my answer to that is test for the drugs that people are using. So they're using marijuana, cocaine, opioids, and amphetamine. If you're using a traditional 5-panel drug test, then you're testing for marijuana, heroin, cocaine, amphetamines, and PCP. But beyond that, there's this whole resurgence of opioid abuse, and that's going to impact what kind of drug testing that you do. Now, let's say you're in a state that has put some restrictions on testing for marijuana. I think you still test for marijuana. It maybe isn't the sole reason that you take some type of disciplinary action against somebody, but it maybe is part of the documentation that you're putting together to terminate someone's employment or to not hire somebody. Again, you're not discriminating, but you're building a case. What prompted the drug test in the first place that resulted in the marijuana positive? Well, absenteeism, tardiness, conflicts at work with management, accidents, workplace violence, who knows? But the drug test becomes part of the story that you tell when you put together your legally defensible reason for terminating someone's employment. But you can't just test for marijuana, because the dramatic increases in abuse have taken place with opioids and amphetamines. So you see amphetamines positives higher than the marijuana positives, the extreme right orange bar with the one on the left. Well, that's unheard of. Marijuana is always number one in positives, okay? But with this one company that works a lot in the oil and gas industry, they're seeing a dramatic increase in amphetamine abuse, amphetamine positives, forgive me, and it's actually eclipsed the level of marijuana. So it would be unwise to just test for marijuana, but it would be just as unwise to eliminate marijuana from your drug test panel. And that's why only 3% of people in our survey indicated that they had done that. We don't know that they made a permanent decision to do that, but we know that it was really a very small percentage of employers that have eliminated marijuana from their drug test panel. It also, even for those 3%, it doesn't mean that they've discontinued drug testing, because as that previous slide showed, there are a lot of people who are using other drugs at dramatic increased rates, like opioids and amphetamines. So let's talk about drug testing. Now, this plays a big, this is a big factor in whether or not you drug test, to understand how these different drug testing methods work and whether it would be good under your situation, not only in terms of your company culture and your drug testing objectives, but the legal factors that apply to your company in the states where you do business. So of course, there's urine drug testing through a laboratory. That's been in place for 30 plus years, more than 30 years. And it's the one drug testing method currently permitted under the DOT drug and alcohol testing regulations if you're covered by those regulations. Then there's point of collection or rapid result urine testing, which is popular, not as popular as lab-based urine testing, but it's kind of plateaued, I think, generally speaking, but it's out there. I think that there's about 15% of drug tests maybe come from the use of these rapid results. Very popular in the temp agency hiring industry, in some safety sensitive remote work locations, et cetera, where it's impractical to get somebody to a collection site. In addition, there's also hair testing, which is also always lab-based. There's no instant hair testing product that I'm aware of anyway. And that's always lab-based. And then there's lab-based oral fluid testing and point of collection oral fluid testing. And I'm going to talk about all of these in a minute, but the real development from 2019 leading into 2020 was the endorsement by the federal government of lab-based oral fluid testing. So the first time in 30 plus years, SAMHSA had endorsed a second drug testing method, lab-based oral fluid testing, to go along with lab-based urine testing. In 2020, SAMHSA issued a notice of proposed rulemaking, an NPRM, for hair testing. Not there yet, maybe a couple of years off still, but now there would be 3 federally endorsed drug testing methods, all lab-based: urine, hair, and oral fluid. So these 3 testing methods are the only federally endorsed drug testing methods available. The good news is that there's 3 testing methods that have been endorsed by the federal government: lab-based urine for 30 plus years, lab-based oral fluid testing with the issue of mandatory guidelines in 2019, and then hair testing with a notice of proposed rulemaking. So still in the process, but obviously the intent there is to make it possible for employers to use hair testing as well. Why do I emphasize this point? Here's the number one reason. Drug testing is a necessary, essential element of a company's efforts to maintain a safe, healthy workplace. I believe that. I've always believed it. And I think it's more true now than it's ever been. In fact, there was a study done by the government, and it's a few years old now, and by a few, I probably mean 20 years old or 15, something like that, but it came out from the federal government in which 40% of illegal drug users who were employed full-time, so these were people who had a job who admitted that they were regular illicit drug users, 40% indicated that they would be less likely to work for a company that did random drug testing, and 30% said that they would be less likely to work for a company that did pre-employment drug testing. So you may be thinking, wow, that eliminates a whole bunch of people that I might want to hire. But my view of it is, why would you want to hire those people? They admit that they're illicit drug users. And anybody who says that they use drugs on their own time and it doesn't affect their workplace performance can't really say that honestly, because the effects of the drug can linger for hours and sometimes days in the case of marijuana. So you really can't just use drugs on your own time and be absolutely 100% sure it's not going to affect your performance of safety sensitive functions like operating a crane lift or a forklift, forklift or a crane or a truck or a transportation van or anything of that nature. I remember as a young boy just graduated from high school, I got a job in a donut and cake mix factory. So my companion and I, we worked in teams of two. We would actually stand in front of an open vat, a big, huge open vat. We would slice open bags of sugar and flour and other ingredients, and we would pour them into the vat. We were literally standing right next to the edge of a vat where we were pouring all these things into. And I didn't use drugs then, I don't use drugs now, but I've often wondered since then, if I was high on marijuana, which affects your depth perception, what would that have been like for me to be constantly looking down into that vat and, emptying the contents of these bags in there? You can see where the potential for danger exists. And so it's not actually honest to say that it doesn't affect job performance. It does, and it can. And there are lots of examples of that. Now, when we talk about urine testing, it is still the gold standard of drug testing. Even though oral fluid and hair have been endorsed by the federal government, for 30 plus years, lab-based urine testing has been the gold standard. It's still the only drug testing method permitted under the DOT regulations. It's legal in all 50 states. It's withstood legal challenges at both the science level and the practical application level in workplaces. You're pretty safe there. It is, however, subject to drug test cheating. So if you want to know how to pass a urine drug test, just type that into your Google search bar and you'll literally get tens and tens and tens of thousands of potential websites that you can visit that will offer you advice and or sell you products to help you cheat on your urine drug test. Observed collections are a little bit awkward, of course, and sometimes that's an issue. Shy bladder can also be used as an excuse not to provide a sample. The window of detection is usually 3 to 4 days at the cutoff levels that we use, but marijuana, for example, can be detected in a urine sample for 2 or 3 weeks after usage, okay? So those are some of the pros and cons of urine testing. When it comes to hair testing, you're talking about a wide window of detection, up to 90 days, which is both a pro and a con to hair testing, because you may want that big giant window of detection to identify lifestyle, but that could actually, in some pro-marijuana, legal marijuana states, conflict with their law that requires you to be able to prove impairment with that positive drug test result. A drug test that shows a 90-day window of detection makes it very difficult to connect the individual's positive result with impairment on the job, because the window is just so long. But the gender issue of observed collections goes away, and it's generally something that you would have a professional conduct. You can do on-site collections for urine with point of collection devices. You can do that with oral fluid, but with hair testing, you really need a professional to conduct that test for you. There's lack of standardization of lab procedures, but that's going to change once these SAMHSA guidelines finally come out in the next couple of years. And there have been some perceived controversies with hair color and hair composition. I think most of that's been resolved scientifically. So I wouldn't be concerned about that. The exposure from not passive inhalation, but passive exposure is a concern because the marijuana, for example, can settle on hair, but you're really not going to, the laboratory is not going to detect that typically. So I don't think that's a concern either, but you'll hear those concerns when it comes to hair testing. On the oral fluid side, I would say that it's probably gaining in popularity because you don't have to use a collection site. So if you're having trouble getting collection sites arranged, and those are things that Orange Tree can resolve for you. But if you're having those issues, then oral fluid testing is so easy. The collection is so easy that you can do it in the workplace. Adulteration is nearly impossible with an oral fluid sample. You don't add bleach or any kind of a household cleaning product to a saliva sample. And the donor and the collector are literally just right in front of each other during the entire collection process. It's legal in lab-based oral fluid testing is legal in 47 states outside of federal regulations. It will be eventually legal under the DOT regulations. Those guidelines were in the works last year. I think COVID has interfered with that. But that's an issue that you can't use oral fluid with DOT testing, for example, right now, but that will change probably, if not this year, early next year, I would think. Which drugs to test for? We talked about these. There's the standard 5 there on the left from the SAMHSA 5 panel. These drugs are all detectable with oral fluid, urine, and hair. But I go to this chart here that shows an 11 panel, not suggesting that you test for all 11 drugs, but test for the drugs that people are using. And I superimposed that chart from earlier to show opioids and amphetamines again. All of these drugs that are listed, all 11 are detectable in urine, hair, and oral fluid, but not included in the standard 5 panel test that I showed on the previous slide. That 5 panel test would be the test typically done for DOT mandated drug testing. And so you might want to test for some of these other drugs, but that wouldn't be allowed under the DOT regulations for DOT testing. Maybe something you want to do for your non-DOT testing purposes. And again, I would say the standard answer to which drugs to test for is test for the drugs that people are using. I'm only going to spend a minute on this slide. Pre-employment testing versus post-hire testing. All of these testing methods have their value. It depends on what your objectives are. So if you're trying to reduce accidents, for example, in the workplace, you have an unusually high level of accidents that lead to injuries or property damage, or even the filing of workers' comp claims. Post-accident testing is not going to prevent that. Random testing is going to be a deterrent to drug use that will result in a decrease in workplace accidents. Post-accident testing is valuable for when you want to take action against somebody who's caused an accident, and you need to make that connection between their impairment on the job or their being under the influence on the job and the participation in or the cause of the accident. Reasonable suspicion, the same thing. There may be lots of different things that trigger a drug test, but the drug test result helps to strengthen the decision to take adverse employment action. Pre-employment testing, going back to Jeff's comments at the very beginning, may deter some people from wanting to work for your company, but they're people that you may not want working for your company anyway. And so the pre-employment testing serves as a deterrent to those individuals applying for jobs with your company and puts you in a stronger position to have a healthy, safe workforce. Now, I'm getting close to the end here. This is a slide that I used last time. I put it on here again just because I knew we'd have people who were not on last week's call or last month's call. But this is how to sort of look at return on investment. And I'm just going to leave these numbers with you, but I want to point to one number in particular, and that's 7,000 there on the second bullet. That's the average cost of an average substance abuser annually. And that number comes from a Navy study where they concluded that the average cost was $7,000 a year. So if you look at all the different things that might motivate you to do drug testing, there are things that weren't in that Navy study that actually go into the full cost of drug abuse in your workplace. For example, they didn't look at workers' compensation claims because you don't file workers' compensation claims in the Navy, or you didn't back at the time that the study was done. I don't know if that's changed. So if we just added that to the result, you would probably see that 7,000 going up. If we added the cost of a workers' compensation claim, the average of which is $24,000. That's the average cost of a workers' compensation claim. And it wasn't in that $7,000 that came from the Navy study. So you're looking at the average cost being higher, especially in safety sensitive industries. In fact, I saw one estimate where it said the average cost was about $35,000 a year for safety sensitive industries when it comes to drug abuse. Now, I'm not backing that up. I'm just saying that the average cost is probably higher than $7,000 a year for workers in safety sensitive industries. Let me just close with this. There are two doctrines of law that apply no matter what: negligent hiring and respondeat superior. Whether you drug test or not, you're still going to be held responsible for the behavior of your workers if they're under the influence of any drug, but marijuana in particular, because that's being legalized throughout the country, when they do things that cause harm to other people. So respondeat superior, as you see in that second bullet, imposes liability on you, the employer, for your workers' acts when they are functioning within the scope of employment. That's somebody who's driving a truck for you, making a delivery. If that individual is high on marijuana or under the influence of marijuana at that time and causes an accident, you will be held responsible for that, for any of the damages that were caused by that accident, because the individual was operating within the scope of employment. Their acts become your liability. Negligent hiring is a little bit different. Look at that third bullet. It imposes liability on an employer when an employee commits an intentional tort, usually outside the scope of employment. So that could be fraud, could be misrepresenting him or herself on behalf of the company, defamation, false imprisonment, etc. But the courts have determined that negligent hiring could impose liability on an employer if that employer could have made a better or a good faith effort to uncover this potential problem behavior with that individual. So if you're not doing drug testing, you're potentially hiring people that could commit an intentional tort, and you might be held responsible for that because you didn't make a good faith effort to identify that type of behavior. Two more slides, very quickly. When it comes to marijuana, have a policy on marijuana, okay? We write lots of drug testing policies, hundreds of them every year. Have a policy that deals with marijuana specifically. Have it built into your drug testing policy. Be clear about what's permitted and what will not be tolerated. Of course, you're not going to discriminate against people who are legal medical marijuana users in Illinois, for example, because it's written right into their law that you can't do that. But also be clear that employees will not be allowed to be at work while under the influence of marijuana, and that there may be consequences for individuals who are at work under the influence of marijuana. And also that you aren't going to hire job applicants who test positive for marijuana unless you're in a state like Nevada that requires you to do that. That does not give you the authority to not hire that individual, okay? But there are very few states that have that restriction in place. Drug testing is legal in all 50 states. Every type of drug testing, from pre-employment to random testing. There may be conditions that you have to comply with, but drug testing is legal in all 50 states. It's still an important service. It's still an important way in which you ensure all of your workers that you're doing everything within your power to create and maintain a safe workplace where they can feel secure when they come to work, and where your customers and your clients can feel secure when they come to do business with you. And with that, I'll turn the microphone back over to Jeff.
Bill, thank you very much. That was fantastic. I know you could, to your point, there's a couple of those charts for sure. We could go into a lot of detail. One thing, as questions come in, just a reminder to everyone that we have a few minutes here to take questions.